Some musicians are driven to create a sound, a rhythm. Others are poets to the people, lyricists who focus on telling a story. For many, it's a balance of both. Gerald Casale wanted to share his message. One chaotic moment under fire from a barrage of M1 bullets would change his life forever. It would permanently shape his perception of the world and inspire him to form a band and write music, which had at its very core 13 seconds of madness. This is a killer soundtrack.
They started firing. I saw two guys drop.
They must have been aiming because they got kids in the parking lot right here while we were trying to run away.
You know, all the kids that were coming from that way didn't even know what was happening here. This dude's pointing that gun at everybody.
Dudes were born 5 different times.
Oh, you and we can't discuss our views. We might as well forget about American freedom.
This was a beautiful day, the first beautiful sunny day of spring that we had. And then I felt my legs go out from under me. When you see live ammunition and the results of it, of people dead and wounded, you're just a little scared rabbit.
The students were fearful that the military was being called in to quell what they thought was legitimate political protest. And the National Guardsmen were worried that the students were radicalized and willing to take up violence to achieve their protests.
It is one of the events that occurred in Ohio that has become internationally known. Images of the Vietnam War, images of Kent State, are part of our common core of memory.
The traumatic events of one day in 1970 would lead the self-proclaimed hippie to the brink of a nervous breakdown. The emotions, realization, and anger would ultimately lead him to form the 1980 sensation Devo, an American new wave band who enjoyed great international acclaim and chart success. Devo was known for its quirky style and is best remembered for their 1980 hit, Whip It. Their surrealist science fiction themes, epitomized by their energy dome hats and the use of theatrical characters such as Bougie Boy, were commonly seen as wacky and comical. They reveled in pushing boundaries, often performing as their own opening act as a Christian soft rock band called Dove, an anagram of Devo. However, their underlying message was anything but humorous. A sinister theme lurked within, one that echoed the direction that Casale's life took in May 1970.
It just was a nightmare that never ended. And only, my friends and I and the people that lived through it know what happened. How many people are willing to die for what they believe in? Not too many.
In the late 1960s, America was experiencing a period of rapid social and economic change. On the surface, it rode a wave of positivity. There were great technological advancements. Man had landed on the moon, and it seemed as though anything was possible. However, it was also becoming a country whose people were increasingly divided.
The late 60s had witnessed a series of riots in major cities like Detroit and Trenton, New Jersey, and Los Angeles and Watts. There was a lot of social and racial tension. The civil rights movement seemed to have stalled, and many people found that crime and injustice seemed to be taking the day.
Civil rights, second wave feminism, women's movement at that point, the environmental movement was growing. There were a whole series of things that characterized the 60s.
Freedom of speech was being exercised more than ever. Politics, leadership, and the status quo of American society were being challenged. The first American combat troops had waded onto Vietnamese shores on March 6, 1965. By 1970, almost 50,000 American soldiers had lost their lives in Vietnam. To many, it was an unnecessary loss of lives and an unnecessary war. On November 15, 1969, the largest anti-war demonstration in American history took place in Washington, D.C., with 250,000 peaceful protesters.
Initially, if you look at polls in the United States during the earlier years of the buildup, there's a fairly favorable attitude. There is a rumbling, and then as the war gets deeper, and particularly after the Tet Offense and the visual impact of that war on nightly TV, that's when you begin to get more and more student protest against the war. You see a nation divided. Their upset was yes with the war, and it may have been yes with the war because they might be going to, but their upset was also with inequality in terms of civil rights.
Students in the late 1960s and early 1970s felt very empowered by protests, unable to really sway the powers that be to take their ideas seriously. Protesting in the streets, often on college campuses, seemed to be one of the most effective ways for students to get their ideas across.
All of that is about changing the world and changing the way we live. So whether it's pig farm commune, or whether it is availability of contraception, or whether it's the ability to smoke whatever you wanted to smoke when you wanted to smoke it, or just to get away from what had become a regularized, very choreographed lifestyle that came out of the 50s that people were expected to fit into. It was a protest against that.
Young people who felt disillusioned about the world they were inheriting had now found an effective voice through the ability to protest. They used this to great effect to express their dismay at America's involvement in the war. Conscription was unpopular, and the proliferation of graphic images shown on nightly news services had raised questions. The war had become ugly. It was much bloodier and more complex than anticipated. Despite the phenomenal resources directed at it, it was now considered by many as unwinnable. Richard Nixon was sitting on a political time bomb. His only option was to withdraw, effectively surrendering to the North Vietnamese in a way that wouldn't be perceived as a surrender by the American people.
Richard Nixon won election in 1968, promising to get the United States out of Vietnam. But in 1970, just the week before the Kent State riots, President Nixon announced an expansion of the war, including the bombing of Cambodia.
Everybody here was upset about the incursion in Cambodia. The assumption was that under Nixon that we were pulling out of Vietnam, and we were lessening the troops, but then the Cambodian incursion basically got into, oh, well, here we go again, and it's Tricky Dick.
The perceived hypocrisy of Nixon's announcement sparked an instant increase in protest activity. At Kent State University, tension was mounting.
In the wake of Richard Nixon's expanding of the war to Cambodia, student protests broke out on campuses across the country.
At Kent State, there were rumors of students with caches of arms, plots to poison the town's water supply with LSD, and plans to blow up the town's main store. Kent City's mayor, Leroy Satram, was concerned that local forces were not capable of handling these possible threats. On May 3rd, he contacted Governor James Rhodes and requested that the National Guard be sent to assist the people of Kent.
There had been 3 days of protests and confrontations between students and protesters at Kent State and the National Guardsmen. The day before, protesters had burned to the ground an ROTC shed on the campus. I think it was the violence and the confrontations between the guardsmen and the students that left both sides on edge.
And then Monday morning, they declared martial law. So the dean of the university, Governor Rhodes of Ohio, conspired, knowing that if they declared martial law, that would make all assemblies illegal. You lose your right to assembly. And of course, the students found out about this. We all found out about it word of mouth. And of course, it didn't deter anybody. The attitude was, up against the wall MF, because we hated these people as much as they hated us. So we gathered, and that's when they, of course, waited till everybody was there, almost 2,000 people on the Commons, and coming out of these buildings were the National Guard. And then more National Guard and vehicles pulled up. They all had gas masks. They all had M1 rifles. And the general, on the bullhorn, he announced, we have declared martial law. You must disperse now. You have no right to assemble. And of course, the students were like, boo, chanting, fuck you. And so they closed in on us. I think their plan was to shoot enough tear gas directionally to force us up the hill, over the hill by the journalism building, where there was a huge parking lot where they had buses ready so they could do mass arrests, put us on the buses, and take us to Portage County Jail in Ravenna, Ohio. Something there in that process turned from a game where students are running from tear gas and chanting and trying to find rocks to throw back, to the National Guard lining up at the top of the hill, freezing. And we're all wondering, what are they doing? And they're just standing there. So we're standing there looking at them. And we're halfway down the hill, and there's many more students all the way down the hill by that parking lot.
You need to see it from the Guard's perspective. They were young people. Some of them, I don't know how many of them, were in the Guard because that meant they were not going to Vietnam. The Guard or the reserves were one way that you were out. They were from that area. What were their feelings about the violence that occurred the night before? What were their feelings that the ROTC building had been torched? The Reserve Officer Training Center had been torched. So there were a lot of wheels going in, but they were the same age, largely the same age. And how well were they trained? That's the big issue. And how afraid were they of what was happening on the campus when the tear gas was being thrown back?
And suddenly, and I can tell you what I saw and tell you what I think I heard, because there was much chaos and much noise, as you can imagine, but I saw them get in a formation at the top of the hill, the Guard, in a row, and I saw the guys in the front kneel. And then I saw a guy in a gas mask that might have been the adjutant general or somebody else screaming. I couldn't understand what he was saying, and he was screaming at them. And then I saw his hand do that. I saw him make a gesture, and they shot at us. We just thought that they were posturing with their bayonets to come start a charge. Would you run away from a guy with a bayonet pointed at you? There had never been any history of these confrontations where they had live ammunition, not even for the anti-war protests in Washington, D.C., or the anti-bomb protests. They hadn't even used live ammunition against the civil rights protest in the South by Martin Luther King and others. They had always used tear gas and dogs and water cannons. So this was a complete, this was a trauma so great, it's hard to explain, because you see movie violence, you see TV violence, and it's all stylized. And when you see real gun violence, there was that moment where they shot and it sure sounded real, and they shot over our heads where I was. So it took a second or two with people screaming behind me and us in a group turning around to realize there were students down. And I saw one guy face down in the roadway that led to the gymnasium with blood running out of his head. And I thought, I felt like I was in Raging Bull, where there's everything goes into slow motion and they use the echoey soundtrack for every punch. And I felt that I went into a kind of a nightmare dream, like a freeze frame. Everything was in slow motion, then sound went away. I remember staring up at the trees that were just starting to bud because winter was finally over and spring was really beginning. And this was a beautiful day, the first beautiful sunny day of spring that we had. And there were buds and a blue sky. And then I felt my legs go out from under me. And I started shaking. I was afraid for my life. I was freaked. And I realized that the girl that I saw in the parking lot was Allison Krauss. And I knew Allison. And I heard them screaming Allison. And I couldn't move. And I realized Allison Krauss was laying there, and I didn't know if she was dead or not. There were people surrounding her. It took me a little while longer to have people screaming to know that that was Jeffrey laying face down behind me. He was definitely dead. You could see that. That's the famous picture where you see that girl screaming and crying on one knee. She was actually a runaway that wasn't even a student. She was just hanging out on campus and not enrolled. And she happened to be right next to him when he got shot.
The horrific result of the 67 rounds fired by the guardsmen in a 13-second burst was the death of 4 students. There were also 9 injuries, some of which were significant, including one student paralyzed from the chest down.
One of the problems with the Kent State shooting was that 28 different guardsmen shot indiscriminately into a crowd of students. They may have felt themselves threatened, but they were firing indiscriminately, showing that there was no particular person that was threatening them.
Did students ever expect that they would be killed protesting? Protests had gone on for a long time. The one at Kent was violent in the sense that the building was torched, and the guard being called out was just amped it up, if you will. That struck a point. It shocked.
The problem in Kent State was not that the guardsmen had firearms. The problem was that the guardsmen were too quick to use them.
I don't know how much time passed. It turns out it was hours before they let us go. We were surrounded by soldiers with guns. We didn't know what they were going to do next. There was screaming and crying. There were professors who had been monitors for the protests that were now, they had armbands and they were begging people not to move, not to do anything, not to protest any longer, shut up. And believe me, that wasn't hard to get people to agree with that, because no matter how brave you think you are and how much chutzpah you think you have as a protester, when you see live ammunition and the results of it, of people dead and wounded, you're just a little scared rabbit. I certainly was.
The shock of seeing students, young students, killed on a college campus resonated.
To many, the Kent State shootings beggared belief. But to Gerald's dismay, local sentiment wasn't as sympathetic to the protesters and even the victims as he had expected.
There were townies and deputized citizens, deputized by the local sheriff, driving around with shotguns and pistols in their regular sedans, hunting for students, because the way that the Record Courier, the local paper, publicized this tragedy, and the way the local radio publicized it, they were saying, students kill guardsmen. And there's records of this. You can see a paper was actually printed with that, and radio show audio exists where they're telling the locals that students had killed guardsmen. So now they think that armed radical students had shot National Guardsmen, and they were out to get us. And nothing could have been further from the truth. The students were unarmed, that was proven. The guards shot live ammunition at unarmed students, that was proven. And when the parents of the 4 dead formed a class action lawsuit, it was thrown out because martial law had been declared, so their children had no right to be there. It's a neat trick, it's a good hat trick. The general population in America, I think it was more than 50% thought that the students deserved to die. They were not sympathetic whatsoever.
4 million students joined a nationwide strike following the tragedy, effectively closing hundreds of schools, colleges, and universities. Ultimately, the tide had now turned as more and more everyday Americans demanded a rapid withdrawal from Vietnam.
So after the killings, students were forbidden to go for 3 months on campus. It was yellow duct taped off like a crime scene. You know, you felt yourself adrift. I had mentioned that I was kind of like, an informed, semi-political, live and let live hippie before the killings. Well, that trauma and that anger as a result of that trauma, woke me up.
At the time of the shootings, popular band Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young were enjoying worldwide success with their track, Teach Your Children. Songwriter Neil Young was so moved by the events at Kent State that he immediately started work on the protest song, Ohio. The track voiced rage and despair and was the boldest musical statement regarding the Vietnam War made to that date. Despite already having a successful track in the charts, incredibly, in just over 2 weeks, Ohio was recorded and released.
We liked Neil Young. We liked him. We liked the record he had come out with before that. We liked Cinnamon Girl. We were surprised that he did that. No one saw it coming. So much today is, the hype is, with the internet, there's instant viral, connection. Millions of people will know instantly. You don't have to wait 3 or 4 months to put out a record, before a record company presses it up. Well, he did it then. I don't know how he did that. That was out within something like 6 weeks of the murders, of the killings on Kent State. He went and recorded that, and he obviously had the channel to distribution through a record label where he went in the studio, they pressed it up, and the rack jobbers and truckers took it around America, and the radio stations started playing it. The fact that song was out there with those lyrics, even though a lot of people didn't really know what he was talking about except, in a cursory way, it made him ask questions. It gave us a voice for a little bit. It was some pushback. Tin Soldiers and Nixon's drumming. It was a real indictment of the fact that we had gone to a point of civil war in America, and Nixon was trampling on First Amendment rights, and he was breaking down the barriers between legislative and executive branches of government. That was good. It created a lot of discussion, a lot of momentary awareness.
Prior to his time at Kent State, Gerald had played bass guitar in a local band called the Numbers Band. There was friction between him and the other band members, and eventually he was unceremoniously dumped after deciding to wear a monkey mask halfway through a live performance. The traumatic shootings at Kent State had steered him in a new direction. He had formed a new dark vision of the world, one that he believed he could voice through his music.
I realized everything I'd been told about the American system was a big lie. It's like when you find out everything your parents told you, including Santa Claus, is a big fluffy fantasy. And that's not how anything works. So it was as if I was reborn into a new reality, and I was a lot more militant and, really fueled by informed, analytical anger. So I started playing music and writing music in my little student apartment quite seriously at that point. There was a guy named Peter Gregg and a friend I had that was a poet named Bob Lewis. We would play blues-oriented songs, but I started to want to be original. And as an artist, I was original. And Bob Lewis, my friend, and I had created a somewhat joke. It was like a serious joke. We called what we were experiencing de-evolution. We thought what was happening in the society was de-evolution. After those killings and getting together over that summer and talking incessantly every night, we thought that things were not progressing, but they were regressing, and that people were getting dumber, and that they were less able to entertain like critical thought. They loved sound bites. They just repeated slogans. And my art was making fun of that. And we called the art Devo, short for de-evolution. And then I started about a year later, trying to figure out what would Devo music sound like. And that's about the time I met Mark Mothersbaugh. And he was a part-time student, and he was taking art classes. His visual aesthetic totally resonated with what I'd been doing. He liked what I was doing, I liked what he was doing, and then we started talking about music, and I found out that he was also a musician, and that he was playing all this kind of prog rock stuff. He was a trained keyboardist, so he was just playing that kind of music with how many changes and how many notes can you play? And I never really liked that. I thought it was wanky, and he really hated the blues music I was doing. So we made a pact as artists that we would recalibrate, and that we would, if we made music, if we got together, it wouldn't be what he had done, or it wouldn't be what I had done. It could only be something that nobody had heard before. That just spurred us to experiment, and anytime somebody started doing anything formulaic, we'd stop and say, no, you can't do that. Why are you making that chord change just because it's been 8 bars and you think you should? So we became minimalist and brutalist.
Gerald Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh were focused on making music that reflected their visual design passion. This was a new and unique approach to music composition. The synergy between the two university pals formed the core of Devo's philosophy. Together, they would become a creative force.
Our influences in art and design came from German Expressionism, the Bauhaus, Russian Constructivism, Dadaism, and that kind of brutal minimalist, like radical, in-your-face, agitprop aesthetic. We hit upon a kind of nomenclature for the music. The music was doing that now. The music was doing what our images had done for us. And that's when it got exciting.
Displaying great foresight and commercial savvy, the band saw themselves as more than just musicians. De-evolution was a concept, and Devo was a brand, a complete stylistic package that would form a template for modern music.
We were in basements and garages weekly, daily, making music, getting better, creating a body of work that we could actually play well, and getting our brothers involved in finding Alan Myers, who was an amazing jazz drummer, and talking him into our aesthetic. We gave him the whole manifesto, the Devo manifesto. Here's what we're doing, and here's what we want you to do. So we made him play with one hand tied behind his back. Well, actually, gaffer taped to his stool on purpose so that he wouldn't play fancy offbeat rolls or anything, that he would take it down to jungle brutalism. because he was so good, even with one hand and 2 feet, he could make a drum kit sound amazing. And we did that, and we converted him from jazz to Devo.
In 1977, David Bowie announced that Devo was the band of the future. In its most successful iteration, Devo featured Gerald on bass, along with his brother Bob on guitar. Complementing this were the Mothersbaugh brothers Mark and Bob on keyboards and guitar. Completing their unique sound was Alan Myers on a conventional acoustic drum kit. This lineup lasted for nearly 10 years. Strategically, they wanted to embrace the cynical observations of subversion that they had witnessed in America's consumerist world. They wanted to sell people things that they didn't know they wanted, to the disgust of many traditional punk bands. Devo were in fact punk to their very core.
The anointed punks of the late 70s, they didn't like Devo. They thought Devo was bullshit, that we weren't punk. They didn't like that the press was calling us punk. And we never cared whether we were punk or not. We didn't call ourselves that. What we felt we had in common with punk was that we were the real punks, meaning that it wasn't about a ripped t-shirt or safety pins or black tight pants. And it certainly wasn't about a certain noise level of 3 chords and screaming. But punk, as we understood it, was a resistance against illegitimate authority. It was a do-it-yourself, nonconformist attitude. Like, what's a punk? A punk refuses to play ball. A punk refuses to go with the program. A punk stands out. Punks were asking for it. There was a certain part of punk that was masochistic. We were like punk scientists because we weren't anti-intellectual, we weren't right-wing, we weren't racist, but we were angry and we knew what we were angry at, and it wasn't in that realm of unformulated anger. So Devo really, from the beginning, had the true punk attitude.
9 years after the tragedy at Kent State, the focus of Devo's philosophy reached new clarity with the satirical track Beautiful World. The timeless track, combined with a compelling video clip directed by Casale, packed a poignant message. It was a protest song in disguise, delivered in an amusing yet scathing way.
When we wrote Beautiful World, when I wrote the lyrics and worked with Mark on the music, I had this idea that I would go back to what first inspired me, which was these underground films from the 60s that New York underground filmmakers were making, like the Kuchar brothers, and people on the West Coast were making, using archival footage, because they had no money, so they'd use a lot of archival and found footage and cut it together to create a collage that suggested a new meaning. And I consciously wanted in Beautiful World to start off where the world was silly and beautiful and people could laugh at this kind of like, kitschy archival footage of the way things used to be, so that people can feel superior and they can see images of people being silly back when, 30s, 40s, 50s, and go, oh yeah, we're not like that now, aren't we so cool compared to that? And take it from there and slowly move them down the rabbit hole from silly fantasy to hardcore reality, the same way that I had been moved from silly fantasy to hardcore reality by the killings at Kent State. And in the song, I don't say it's a beautiful world for you, but not for me, until like about 3 minutes in. So the idea was to sustain this kind of suspense and get darker and darker and start showing police beating protesters, start showing Atomic Energy Commission film of nuclear bomb blasts and the results of those bomb blasts on the Japanese, and propaganda films about how you could avoid radiation, those kind of duck and cover tests that kids had to do when they were being drilled about the Russians are going to kill us, it's going to be World War III, and just move it from there like all the way so that when I say it's a beautiful world for you but not for me, there's the punch.
In what can be seen as a 3.5-minute synoptic transfer from the mind of its creator, the world devolves before our very eyes. Decades after it was written, it still feels disturbingly relevant.
Well, I think the best art, whether it's music or visual or whatever, is both of its time and then hits something in it that's universal that becomes timeless. If you're in that sweet spot, even if a song was inspired by a real event, like Street Fightin' Man by the Rolling Stones, right? That I think was inspired by the '68 riots in Paris. You don't need to know about the '68 riots in Paris to be put in that mindset and feel that song that's still as powerful now to me as it was then. Or Sympathy for the Devil. In Devo's case, I think, Beautiful World and Freedom of Choice, where we're saying freedom of choice is what you want, freedom from choice is what you got, because we were criticizing conformist, lemming-like mentality of the American electorate because they wanted Reagan. But you don't need to know that. Freedom of choice deals with this ambiguity in human nature about their willingness to give up their own freedom, just like people vote against their own self-interests. There's a part of them that want told what to do. And boy, there's plenty of people ready to do that. I'm the most satisfied with that video out of, there's maybe 20 Devo videos, I think. And then I went on to direct videos for other bands, about 60 or 70 videos through the years. And Beautiful World is my favorite video I ever got to direct out of anything. And it's timeless. You watch it now, it's unfortunately the same story. We're always scratching our way back to square one, because human nature doesn't change. So the struggle between, the dark side of human nature, authoritarianism, violence, evil, and human achievement it's eternal. You got to be vigilant all the time. That's why there always needs to be resistance and protest, because otherwise they'll run right over you, because they're hell-bent on it. They want what they want as much as you want freedom. They want to take it away.
A half-century after the events at Kent State, Devo's theory seems as contemporary as when Bob Lewis and Gerald Casale first conceptualized it. It's now often labeled as prophetic. Gerald is confident that de-evolution is alive and unwell.
With Beautiful World, it's on the simplest level, it's one man's opinion. And that one man was me. I really meant, because of what had happened to me and what I saw and what I knew, the world was no longer a beautiful world. Humans ruined the beauty of the world. I mean, more and more and more, I like to avoid humans. I love animals. I love nature. I feel good. I mean, when you look at how incredible the earth is, and it truly is. And we still haven't found anything else like it. It's diabolical and just, indefensible that humans, quote, 7 billion strong, are going about systematically shitting where they eat, like destroying their own backyard. It's incredible. And obviously, what will happen is nature will fight back, like the body fights back against a virus. And we will destroy the environment that sustains us. We will go away, and then the earth will be as beautiful as it was, 50,000 years ago. People today don't think that this idea of de-evolution is some kind of polarizing radical idea anymore. People would hate Devo or love Devo or think it was a big joke. But now, clearly, in retrospect, what we were railing against and warning about is all taken place. Devo's just part of the fabric of pop culture, and everybody knows that de-evolution is real. I can't find anybody that even argues about it. It's like, oh yeah. That's why I've said in interviews that Devo is the house band on the Titanic at this point. We're just there to play you a soundtrack as we all go down together, as the inevitable happens.
But he remains acutely aware of the traumatic day at Kent State University that changed the course of his life and his music forever.
When you're 19, 20 years old, those are the formative years that form your values, that form your worldview, and I can't get rid of what I know. I can't pretend I don't know what I know. I can't suddenly be a happy guy.